The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Michelle Lowther with Continuity Housing, and I'd like to welcome you to what I can say from experience is a comprehensive, informative, and entertaining tropical weather outlook. It's going to be quick this morning, and we'll have a short Q&A at the end. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can just use the chat feature on the webinar control panel on your screen to send those to me, and we'll be sure to take time to answer those at the end. Continuity Housing has worked with Impact Weather for several years now, and we're honored to have their lead hurricane forecaster and Tropics Watch Manager, Chris Hebert, here today to give us a short rundown on what's going on in the tropics and what we can expect for the rest of the season. Chris is a 33-year veteran of hurricane forecasting and one of the nation's leading experts on tropical activity. Continuity Housing provides our clients with guaranteed housing for critical personnel in the event of any type of business disruption, regardless of the reason, although certainly disastrous weather is the #1 leading cause of interruption activity and obviously top of mind at this time of year. For more information about our unique services, you can visit continuityhousing.com. So Chris, the tropics have been relatively quiet this season. Why don't you tell us more about that?
All right, well, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, it's been a bit quiet out there this season, but I do see some signs that things are about to change, and we'll talk about that over the next 15 minutes. I'll talk about what's happened so far, a little bit of climatology, some of the shorter-term predictors that we're seeing as far as potential development over the next couple of weeks, and the longer-range predictors that extend out through the rest of the season. And finally, we'll talk about what our current forecast is for the number of storms and the areas that are going to be at higher risk this season. Now, it's been active, at least in terms of the numbers of storms so far this year. We've had 5 named storms form so far, and now just in the past week we had Tropical Storm Erin form in the far eastern Atlantic. Now, typically when we have earlier season or storms forming before August in the deep tropics, that's a sign of an active peak season. We're approaching the peak season very soon, and so far things are fairly quiet out there. Typically, that 5th storm, Erin, that we had form last week doesn't form until the end of August, and we don't see the first hurricane form until about the 10th of August. Well, it's already the 21st of August, still no sign of a hurricane, and I don't think we're going to see a hurricane through the month of August. Now, if we look at the activity around the world, one of the ways we measure hurricane activity is by calculating what's called the accumulated cyclone energy. It's a fancy term, but it's just a product of the maximum sustained wind in a storm, a tropical storm or hurricane, and how long it maintains that maximum wind and how long it lasts as a storm. As you see out in the Atlantic Basin, the current ACE value is less than 10. We've had 5 storms, each with a total number less than 2 points. We've had some major hurricanes in the basins that maybe have 30, 40, or 50 points all by themselves. So we've had some fairly weak storms this year. And activity is not only down in the Atlantic about half of normal, but as we look over toward the rest of the globe, just about all basins are below normal right now in terms of activity. The Western Pacific, about half the normal activity out there. I'm not really sure what the reason is for the decline in activity. That's not just this year, but in the past several years worldwide as well. In the past 8 years, the United States has not been hit by a major hurricane. The last Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricane to hit the United States was Wilma in October of 2005. We're in a record period now. Typically, a major hurricane, Category 3, 4, or 5, strikes the United States about every year, year and a half. And we had Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast last year as a transitioning storm to a non-tropical, extratropical storm there. It had hurricane force winds, but it was at most a Category 1 off the coast. We had Irene the year before, another storm that weakened below hurricane strength before impacting the Northeast. So we've had some major impacts, but we haven't had any Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricane in almost 8 years. And that's a record long time. I really would be surprised if we make it through the season without one of those striking the United States coastline. Climatologically, September, late August to September, the storms can form just about anywhere in the tropics, all the way from the coast of Africa near the Cape Verde Islands to just about anywhere off the northeast U.S. coast. So it's favorable out there this time of year. This is the peak season we're approaching. We're on August 21st right now. The peak starts in about the first week of August and rises up to the peak on September 10th and then drops off slowly from there till about the third week of October. That's when we see about 90 or 95% of all named storms form. We're well into that sharp rise, but it's very quiet out there now. After Aaron last week, we don't have anything going on in the tropics, and Aaron couldn't last more than a day or two out there. What's the reason for that? Well, there's a thing called the Saharan air layer. It's a layer of dust and dry air that occasionally is pushed off the west coast of Africa by a building high pressure to the north of the tropics, where you see that high pressure here. And when that high pressure strengthened in late July, it pushed off a giant surge of dust, one of the biggest surges we've seen in a while. The dry, dusty air went through the eastern Caribbean, actually made it into Texas and Louisiana about a week later. A very dry, dusty air is not conducive to development. This is a photograph from a NOAA research plane showing the air approaching the Caribbean Sea a few weeks ago. And you can imagine it's kind of hard to get a hurricane going when air is so dry and dusty like that. So it's been very quiet because the Saharan air layer has been a bit stronger than normal in the past few weeks. What's happening out there now? Well, this is our outlook for the coming week, and we have a couple of disturbances identified. Here at Impact Weather, we began counting the number of disturbances as they move off the coast of Africa in May, and we just keep counting up through 35 and 36, which is where we are right now. By the end of the season, we'll typically be looking at disturbance 65 or 70, or maybe a little bit higher than that. So we're about the middle parts of the season now. We're just past the mid parts, and we're moving into the peak. We're at disturbance 35 and 36, and neither one of those looks likely to develop. There's hardly any thunderstorm activity in the Caribbean Sea associated with disturbance 35, and there's very little in the way of thunderstorm activity associated with 36 just off the coast of Africa. The reason for that is, if we look at the current dusty air out there in the tropics, we have that orange and yellow Saharan air extending almost to the eastern Caribbean, and 36 is surrounded by that dry, dusty air. That's why it's not developing there. Now, we do have another disturbance that's just about to push off the coast of Africa, and we'll have to keep an eye on that one. It has a little bit more moisture, and it's a little bit farther south. If we look eastward across Africa, we can see the region of moisture. That's where the tropical waves originate. Actually, they originate over the Ethiopian highlands here as disturbances move in from the Indian Ocean across the highlands, and we have waves of low pressure that propagate westward. There have been a few less disturbances than normal this year, and they certainly are weaker than normal across Africa right now, and that may be another reason why it's so quiet out there, at least currently. But like I said, there's a disturbance right here, and some of the models are indicating that it might potentially develop in 4 or 5 days down the road, and something we're going to have to keep an eye on. One of the tools we can use to predict potential development over the next maybe 2 or 3 or 4 weeks is something called a Madden-Julian oscillation. It was identified by a group of scientists, Madden-Julian, back in the 1970s. And what it is a pulse of increased thunderstorm activity, increased hurricane development that starts out in the Indian Ocean, moves across the western Pacific, moves from west to east, and eventually it reaches the eastern Pacific. And Maloney and Hartman, another couple of scientists, discovered that once this pulse reaches the eastern Pacific, we tend to have a burst in tropical cyclone development in the Atlantic Basin, particularly in the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. And the pulse typically lasts around 10 days or so as this Madden-Julian oscillation pulse is moving across the region. What do we have out there right now? Well, we do have, and this is the current conditions out there across the tropics, the green areas represent rising air and increased thunderstorm activity. The brownish areas indicate sinking air, less likely development. Of course, we see that sinking air over the tropical Atlantic over here, but if you look over in the central Pacific right now, we have that massive rising air, and that is associated with the leading edge of one of these Madden-Julian oscillation pulses. We've had 3 tropical cyclones develop to the south and southwest of Hawaii over the past few days, and another one, it looks like it's going to be developing further east over toward the coast of Mexico in the next day or two. So this pulse is gradually translating eastward, and by next week at this time, we think that rising air pulse is going to be reaching the eastern Pacific and just edging into the Gulf of Mexico and the western Caribbean Sea. That should make the conditions there more favorable for development. And if we look further east, that sinking air between the Caribbean Sea and Africa is diminishing, which means conditions there are going to be more favorable for development as we approach the end of August. So their patterns are changing out there right now to a more favorable one for development. I think we're going to see this quiet period ending right about the time of Labor Day weekend. See the rising air there. Let's talk about some of the longer range predictors beyond the next couple of weeks. El Nino and La Nina, what's happening in the tropical Pacific, water temperatures in the Atlantic, and high pressure that can govern where the systems develop and where they track this season. First of all, this is the trace of water temperatures in the tropical Pacific, where we look for the cool waters of La Nina below this blue dashed line, or the red warm waters of El Nino above the red dashed line. The black line is the trace of water temperature since October of 2012 all the way up to the present time, which is right at the end of the graphic here. These squiggly lines at the end are the various models that are predicting what the water temperature is going to do over the coming months. If you look at the forecast is for the water to sharply rise in the next few days and, well, not quite get to the El Nino range during the season, but rise above normal. I tell my forecasters, whenever you have a forecast that's trending slowly downward like this and you forecast it to instantly make a 90-degree turn, your forecast is probably going to be wrong. In this case, I think that it's going to be wrong. The water temperatures are staying cool in the tropical Pacific, not quite to the La Nina range, which would tend to enhance activity in the Atlantic Basin, but cool enough that it's certainly not going to be any inhibiting factor through the months of September, October, and into November. So I think we're going to have a season that extends well in past September, probably into October this year. An El Nino season typically ends early. No signs of an early ending season this year. Water temperature is quite warm out there, and the warmth this year is distributed farther south into the deep tropics here between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, which is important because that's where the hurricanes form that can enter the Caribbean Sea and perhaps, of course, hit the islands in the Caribbean or threaten the United States mainland. Last year, we had warmer water up here in the subtropic, and we had a lot of hurricane activity up there. This year, the trend so far is for development farther south, and we think that's a greater threat for the Caribbean Sea and eventually to the United States. More significant, perhaps, than water temperature is how deep that warm water goes. And if we look at what's something called the oceanic heat content, the oceanic heat content is a measure of how deep the warm water is across the tropics. And we look in the Western Caribbean Sea, and we have a tremendous amount of oceanic heat available, so that any system moving through the Caribbean Sea reaches the Northwest Caribbean, and if all other conditions are favorable for development, there's enough heat energy for it to become a very strong hurricane. One thing I see is a look across the Gulf of Mexico. Well, a couple of things. First of all, over in the central Gulf, we see the warmth related to what's called the loop current, a current of warm water that moves out of the Caribbean, loops around the Gulf, moves back through the Florida Straits, and becomes the Gulf Stream. But if you look in the eastern Gulf, we see an area of less oceanic heat content. Cooler water below the surface there, and that might be a factor of some of the late winter or late spring cold fronts that we had through the area, cooling the water down deeply below the surface. And that's a good sign for folks that might live along the coast of Florida here on the northwest coast and up through the Florida Panhandle, because systems moving out of the south might have less heat energy to become stronger hurricanes in that region should something track through that region in the next couple of months. One other tool we can look at is a projection of where the below normal pressures are going to be in the season. Last year we had higher pressures across the Caribbean Sea and across the deep tropics. The higher pressure promotes sinking air, less thunderstorm activity, and that's why we had storms struggling as they moved through the Caribbean, struggling to maintain their intensity as they moved through the Caribbean. This year, the forecast from all the models, this is a group of all the different models from August through October, predicting still below normal pressures from the Caribbean Sea to Africa and also across the Caribbean Sea through the Gulf of Mexico. Where we have lower pressures, where we typically would expect the storms to track. So that's a bad sign for the Caribbean Sea and over toward the Gulf of Mexico, perhaps the southeastern U.S. this year. Let's take a look at some of the analog years. And an analog year is a year in the past with a similar ocean temperature pattern in the Atlantic and a similar ocean temperature pattern in the tropical Pacific, whether there's La Nina or El Nino or maybe a neutral year there, and also similar patterns of jet streams across the United States and across the Atlantic Basin in general. Just basically everything looks the same as it is now, or similar. If we look back through history, we can find some seasons, 1961, 96, and those other years there that had a very similar setup going into the latter part of August. So we might assume that if the patterns then are now the same as they were then we might see storms developing and tracking in somewhat similar manners. And we see a couple of different track patterns through these analog years, and one of them, by the way, was 2008, which featured some significant hits in Ike hitting southeast Texas. Gustav is not showing up here, but it hit south central Louisiana, and Dolly hit the south part of Texas here. It's not showing up on this graphic. 96, we had some significant storms, Fran and Bertha, hitting the southeastern U.S. over here toward the Carolinas. So we've had some significant impact, not just across the Caribbean, but also across the Gulf Coast and the southeast U.S. during these analog years. Based on these analog years, we think that we're going to see a couple of different track patterns, again, very similar to this in the coming season. First of all, across the Caribbean Sea, which looks like it'll be more favorable for intensification this year than it was last year. And also just north of the Caribbean Sea, threatening the southeastern U.S., which includes Florida, and all through the Carolinas here, even up toward the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and off of Nova Scotia coastline, because that warm water extends very far north this year, which might allow systems tracking over that region to maintain hurricane intensity. We think that just about all the areas here, not just through the Caribbean, but along the U.S. coastline, are going to be at slightly higher than normal risk. Now, I don't think it's really extremely high, much higher than normal, but I think a little bit higher than normal risk for an impact this year, just because of the pattern that's still out there right now. Even though it's fairly quiet, we think it is going to get fairly active in the next week or two out there in the tropics. So if you live anywhere in these red areas, I think you certainly have to be prepared, and you have to be prepared every year, because hurricanes can strike even in a quiet year. You might be in the one area that gets hit by that one hurricane. So it looks like we're going to probably make it. Oh, I didn't mention here, as far as number of storms here. Earlier this year, we were looking at maybe 18. In July, we dropped it to 16, but I think right now we're probably going to drop that total number down to 14 named storms, with only 6 hurricanes. Now, I've looked back at some of the recent years in which the first hurricane didn't form until after the 1st of September, and average about 5 or 6 hurricanes in those seasons, except for 2001, where we had 9 hurricanes form after September 1st. But I think it's probably going to be closer to about 14 named storms now, which is a little higher than normal. Normal for the past 30 or 40 years being about 12 named storms. About 6 hurricanes and about 3 intense Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes this season. If we make it to 14 named storms, that means that the last name that will be used this year would be Melissa. We've already had Andrea Beria, Chantal, Dorian, and Aaron. Next storm on the list is Fernand, which might form within the next week in the eastern Atlantic. Well, that's a look at the outlook for the rest of the season, and I'll take any questions that we have right now.
Great. Thanks, Chris. We do have a few questions, but before we get into those, I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us. You're always able to put so much information into such a concise presentation, so I'm sure everybody on the call would agree. Job well done. Okay, let's see what we have here. We've got Rick in Pensacola with a question. This says, I heard about the potential for a slightly cooler and wetter winter season this year. Does that have any impact on the hurricane season?
Well, the fact that we're getting some cold fronts reaching near the Gulf Coast in August might signal an early fall pattern this year. And what typically happens as we move into mid-September is the higher impact risk area shifts from Texas and Louisiana over toward the central to Gulf Coast over to Florida. Florida is typically hit in later September and October. But if the pattern shifts a little bit early, then your area over there toward Pensacola and Florida in general may be threatened a little bit earlier than they typically would be during the hurricane season.
Great, makes sense. Here's another one. This is from Cheryl, joining us from New York City. Will the current situation with the jet stream lifting to the north affect the possible development or path of any developing storms in the Gulf?
Affect the storms in the Gulf? Well, the current pattern that we're seeing out there is we've had some significant cold fronts moving off the East Coast as well, and a persistent trough that's sitting along the East Coast. That might be enough to keep the storms away from New York this year, I'm thinking. Maybe not enough to keep them away from the Carolinas. But that feature that is that same trough might help to keep more of the storms tracking north of the Caribbean Sea than allowing them to track through the Caribbean Sea and into the Gulf of Mexico. But the systems that don't develop until later are going to be moving into the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, thank you. This one is from Eric. It says, if 2008 is an analog year, which I think you talked about in your presentation about similar patterns to this year, should we be concerned about a repeat of Ike?
Well, I think that in any year you should be concerned about a hurricane hitting your area. It doesn't matter how many storms are forecast, and just because 2008 is a year with a similar pattern, it doesn't mean the storms are going to take the exact same track. If Ike had formed a day earlier or a day later, we might be talking about the big Ike that hit Florida or maybe South Texas. So it all depends on just where they form, but it does mean that folks across the northwestern Gulf of Mexico should pay very close attention throughout the season, as you should every season, because there is a potential to be impacted this year.
Okay. And this is the last one I see. If anybody else has any questions, please use that chat feature on your webinar control panel to send those to us. This last one is from Maryland. It says, are the dust storms coming off of Africa finished for the season, and could that mean more development in the eastern Atlantic?
That's a good question. I think the dust storms, all the signs are there that they're going to be quitting about this time next week. It looks like the one we're seeing right now may be one of the last significant surges, and it does look like they may be subsiding. Now, typically, when these same systems that move off the coast of Africa track across the Caribbean and often move into the Eastern Pacific, when they're not developing in the Atlantic Ocean, guess what? They're moving across Central America and they're developing in the Eastern Pacific, and that's what we've been seeing out there recently. When they start developing in the Atlantic, we see a decrease in activity in the Pacific. So what I expect is that we're going to have some activity in the Eastern Pacific over the next 4 or 5 days, and then it's going to shut down because I think we're going to have to watch for potential development in the Atlantic Basin. So it does have a factor. It does play a part in the potential activity in the Eastern Pacific when the activity in the Atlantic Basin is squelched by the Saharan air layer.
Makes sense. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We don't have any more questions at this time, so I just want to thank you again, Chris. Great information, as always. And I'd like to ask everybody attending if you could just take less than a minute to complete a short survey that's going to pop up when we wrap up here in a moment. I would sure appreciate that. Chris, thank you again for the update, and thanks to everybody that joined us today.